Do you believe people can really change? Or do they just get better at hiding things?
Jason has always been the golden child, the one whose mistakes were painted as learning experiences, while my smallest missteps became proof that I was difficult, ungrateful, or too ambitious for my own good. Sitting at that Thanksgiving table, watching him lean back with his wine glass tilted like he was already toasting his victory, I couldn't help but remember all the little injustices that had stacked up over the years like unpaid bills. I remembered the Christmas when I asked for a guitar and Mom told me it was too expensive, only for Jason to wheel in a brand new drum set that cost twice as much. I remembered applying for scholarships and juggling two part-time jobs through college while Jason's tuition was quietly covered, his apartment rent paid, and his every stumble explained away as he just needs time to figure it out. I worked through summers that felt endless, saving for textbooks while Jason vacationed in Cancun. I remember the day my car broke down in the middle of winter, and I begged my parents for a small loan to help repair it so I wouldn't lose my job. Mom said, "You'll figure it out, you're resourceful." A week later, Jason rolled up in a shiny new SUV with a red bow on it, courtesy of the same parents who had just told me they couldn't spare a dime. And then there was my wedding. I had a small one in a community hall because I was paying for it myself. My dress was off the rack, altered by hand, and I cooked half the food with my best friend just to make it happen. Jason, meanwhile, had a country club ceremony with chandeliers dripping crystal and a string quartet, all footed by Mom and Dad. I remember standing in the bathroom that night, watching my reflection in the mirror, telling myself that if I kept working harder, saving smarter, and biting my tongue, one day it would matter. One day I would matter. As Jason reached for the stuffing and made some offhand joke about finally inheriting something useful, I caught Megan's smug glance across the table. She had always been good at making me feel like the outsider, the one who hadn't managed to check off the right boxes, the husband, the kids, the picture-perfect life framed on a mantelpiece. She leaned close to him and whispered something that made him laugh, and in that moment I felt the years of resentment coil inside me like a spring wound too tight. Jason never asked if I was okay. He never wondered how I managed to pay bills, how I got through nights of exhaustion when my jobs overlapped and I barely had enough time to sleep. He assumed that everything I had was temporary, fragile, something I should eventually hand over because it was never really mine to begin with. And Mom, with her carefully rehearsed speech about tradition and legacy, sat at the head of the table nodding as if the home I had poured myself into belonged to him by default. I glanced down at my plate, swirling the cranberry sauce with my fork, and let the silence stretch just long enough to make them think I was faltering. Jason straightened his tie, as if preparing for a business deal he had already won. "You should just sign it over," he said finally, his voice smug, deliberate, full of the confidence of a man who has never once been told no. "You don't even have a family to fill it. What's the point of holding on to something that clearly belongs with us?" The audacity of it was so thick I almost laughed, but instead I looked him directly in the eye and tilted my head, letting the smallest smile curl at the corner of my mouth. He thought I was breaking. He thought I was moments away from surrendering because I always had before, because that was the script my family had written for me since childhood. But what he didn't realize, what none of them realized, was that I had stopped playing by their script a long time ago. Mom placed her hand over his, nodding with a kind of righteous finality that made my blood run cold. "He's right," she said softly, like a judge delivering a verdict she believed no one could appeal. "He has children, responsibilities. You've always been independent. You'll be fine." Independent. That word had been my curse and my salvation, the excuse they used every time they denied me help, and the very thing that had allowed me to carve out a life on my own terms. I sat back, folded my napkin, and studied each of their faces in turn, Jason's smugness, Megan's triumph, Mom's certainty, Dad's quiet avoidance. They thought this was the climax, the part where I gave in, but they had no idea the story had already shifted beneath their feet. I let the silence hang just long enough for Jason to open his mouth again, ready to deliver another smug little decree. That was when I leaned forward, lowered my voice just enough to make him strain to hear, and said, "Funny you think it's yours. You might want to ask the bank whose name is actually on the deed." The words landed like a stone dropped in water, sending invisible ripples through the table. Jason's smile faltered for the first time, Megan's fork froze midair, and Mom's eyes narrowed, not yet understanding, but already sensing she was losing control. I didn't elaborate. Not yet. I just let the weight of the words hang in the air, letting them chew on the possibility that their perfect plan had a flaw they had never considered. And in that moment, the entire room shifted. The balance of power tilted, and for the first time in years, they looked at me not as the forgotten child, not as the backup plan, but as a threat they hadn't accounted for. The only sound was the clink of Jason's glass as he set it down too hard, the stem nearly snapping under his grip. He cleared his throat, trying to recover, trying to smother the sudden crack in his confidence. But the silence around him was louder than any argument he could make. The thing about pressure is that it never announces itself as cruelty. It arrives dressed as reasonableness and tradition and practicality, and it speaks in low patient tones that promise peace if you will only comply. Which is exactly how my mother leaned in with her napkin folded into an immaculate triangle and said that any decent person who understood family would recognize that a house is not just wood and drywall, but the heart of a lineage that must keep feeding in, the chest of the one who can grow it with children and Christmas mornings and school bus stops, while my sister-in-law, who loves a jury she thinks she can sway, nodded with an expression that translated to "we all know what the right thing is," and my brother, emboldened by the chorus, added that I would look gracious in this moment if I agreed to transfer the deed before dessert so the kids could sleep tonight knowing the home was theirs. I watched them heap certainty onto certainty the way people pile food onto a plate when they are sure more is always better, and I let their language circle the table like a slow ceiling fan cutting heavy air. While I mentally rewound to the spring morning when I stood in an unfriendly bank lobby with my palms sweating into a folder because I had learned that the second mortgage my parents took out to float Jason's business had slipped past grace and into delinquency. And the bank manager, who did not know me from anyone, explained in careful phrases that the institution would proceed according to policy unless a qualified buyer appeared, and I realized in a breath so sharp it tasted like metal that the house everyone considers a birthright is, to the people who truly own the paper, nothing more than an asset that can be moved like a chess piece if you understand the rules. They kept pressing and I kept breathing, one slow measured inhale after another, and when Jason brought up my lack of children again as if my uterus were a ledger that disqualified me from property rights, I cut him off with a single raised hand and an expression I learned from years of being talked over in rooms with men who confuse volume with logic. Then I said, in a tone that matched their faux civility so perfectly that for a second they thought I had surrendered, that I had brought something to make the conversation simpler, which is when I reached into my bag and placed an oblong envelope on the tablecloth, like a quiet stone breaking the surface of a lake that had looked calm only because no one had bothered to throw anything heavy into it. Mom glanced at Dad as if searching for the cue card he never carries. Megan leaned so far forward her pearl earring brushed the rim of her water glass. And Jason smirked with the confidence of a man who has never read fine print because people have always summarized it for him, and before he could make some joke about my dramatics, I told them that long before tonight. Long before this dinner with the carved turkey and the creamy casseroles and the deliberate seating chart that put me in the visual position of the witness stand, I had spoken to the bank about the loan, the arrears, the timeline, and the quiet auction no one at this table had bothered to mention, and that I had provided documents proving my solvency and my intent, and that a purchase agreement had been executed with a speed that would have impressed even Jason's favorite closing lawyer if he had been the one doing the work. Megan tried to say that such things could not happen without notice, and I held her gaze and explained that notice had indeed been sent, certified and documented, only not to the family group chat where she reigns as Queen of Calendar Invites, but to the address of record, and that signature receipts do not require understanding, they require presence, and my mother, who has always prided herself on signing whatever keeps the house quiet, blinked as if a hard wind had hit her from the side, because she was suddenly remembering a morning in May when she scribbled her name while rushing to a dental appointment and told herself she would read it later. Jason reached for the envelope like a child snatching at a toy that someone else is finally interested in, and I slid it to my mother instead, because despite everything I was raised to respect the person at the head of the table. And because I wanted the truth to travel through the exact hands that had shaped the story about who deserves what, and when she opened it the paper made that soft rasping sound that always follows a sealed certainty coming undone, and her eyes moved left to right, swallowing terms and dates and initials that she recognized as her own, until the color in her face changed in a way I had seen only once before on the day she realized my scholarship-covered tuition she could no longer control. Dad cleared his throat with the weary dignity of a man who has lived most of his life as a human, pausing others so they can gather their words, and he asked gently, almost kindly, whether this meant what he thought it meant. And I told him with no malice that the bank had accepted my offer, that the arrears had been cured not with a miracle, but with years of double shifts and the kind of budgeting that turns life into a math problem you solve every single day. And that the title had moved. Without ceremony, because money, unlike family, does not care who cries when the ink dries. Silence lengthened the room, stretching the walls like a canvas being pulled tight across a frame, and I let it hold because a lesson is not learned until the quiet becomes unbearable. Then Jason recovered his voice and tried a different tactic, a smoother one, promising to reimburse me if I would transfer the deed back, because after all we are family, and surely I did not intend to humiliate him in front of his wife and children, and I told him that humiliation had never been my intention, that clarity was the goal, and that clear things sometimes sting when they are first brought into light that is not filtered through the lens of favoritism. My revenge in that moment was not a shout or a slam or a dramatic storming out. It was the simple act of letting the legal truth sit between us like a centerpiece they had not ordered. A floral arrangement made of dates and signatures and line items they had assumed were beneath them, and as my brother reached for arguments that no longer applied, the family mythology that always rescued him began to look threadbare, and he knew it. And so did my mother, and so did I. I kept my voice even as I told them there was one more document, something we should discuss before pie is served, and I placed a second unopened envelope beside my plate without touching it. Then folded my hands and watched the blood drain from Jason's face as he realized that the story they thought they were writing had already moved to another chapter they had not imagined and were not prepared to read. My mother held the first envelope like it might leap up and bite her, the crisp paper gone limp along the fold where her hands trembled. And while Jason sputtered about fairness and legacy and how I must have misunderstood the spirit of what a family home represents, I slid the second envelope toward the center of the table with the same calm I used when I counted tips at midnight after a double shift, a calm that never comes free but must be earned through years of being told to wait my turn, while someone else skips the line. And I said that if we were discussing legacy, then we should at least define the word in terms that exist outside the family group chat, because banks, title officers, county clerks, and accountants do not use the language of sentiment when value is on the table, which is why I had asked a different set of professionals to help me translate what our history actually costs. Jason reached for the envelope, but Megan's fingers were already there first, pinching the corner with that particular brand of theatrical poise she reserves for moments when she wants to look composed on the security camera of fate. Yet I kept my eyes on my father, whose gaze had sharpened with a clarity I recognized from childhood car rides when he would stare straight ahead in traffic, because looking to the side would mean admitting that something was wrong, and I told him that the second envelope did not concern the deed or the mortgage or any document the bank might wave around to make a point about responsibility, but rather something quieter and older and tucked behind a different story entirely. A story that began the year my grandmother died and left a small, stubborn trust in her will intended to help the firstborn grandchild with education or housing. A trust that was supposed to be kept separate from the arguments of the living and the entitlement of the loudest. My mother's head jerked slightly as if a hidden wire had been tugged because she remembered that well better than anyone, and I explained that while the trust had sat nearly dormant for years with a conservative drip of interest, it had not been forgotten by the state records or the firm that filed the annual statements, And that when I went asking questions about who exactly controlled the disbursement schedule, I found language that was both specific and inconvenient for people who believed tradition could outvote documents, language that named me as the intended beneficiary under a clause written in my grandmother's own brittle cursive. A clause that took precedence over family consensus and left no space for reinterpretation by those who preferred narrative over math. Megan tried a laugh that sounded like a teaspoon hitting a plate, bright and brittle, and asked whether I was really dragging old lady money into a holiday dinner, as if that were not vulgar. But I told her that vulgarity is pretending fairness exists while you draft everyone else into subsidizing the golden child, and I described how the trustee, perhaps tired of filing annual reports into an unvisited drawer, had been willing to update the management arrangement the moment a beneficiary demonstrated competence and need with the appropriate forms, and I had done exactly that with the same steady hand I used to sign the purchase agreement, which meant that the tuition I once paid through 2 jobs and the down payment I scraped together when no one in this room backed me now had a retroactive guardian standing up for them from beyond the grave, and that guardian had finally found my signature. Jason demanded to know why no one had told him, why no one had told my mother, why no one had told the man who needed the most, and the corner of my mouth betrayed a smile because the answer was as simple as a locked door. Which is to say that not every room is yours just because you are used to walking into them, and I told him the trustee had mailed notices for years and received no responses because they were addressed to the person named, not the crowd around her, and that silence, unlike affection, accrues interest whether you intend it or not. My father's eyes flicked from the envelope to my mother and back again, and with a careful breath I explained that I had arranged for a portion of the trust to be directed toward a repairs escrow on the house, that the roof which my parents had postponed fixing because they were juggling Jason's business burn rate would now be replaced without any of us needing to pass a hat at this table, and that I had earmarked another portion for a fund to support small grants in our old neighborhood school, where my grandmother volunteered in the library, a decision she would have found practical and maybe a little defiant, which is to say exactly like her. And if Jason wanted to call that revenge, then he could do so while the new shingles went up and the library stocked fresh paperbacks for children whose names my mother has never bothered to learn. Megan accused me of laundering righteousness to make selfishness look noble, and my mother, letting her voice slip into that familiar register that equals command in this house, said that I had made them look small in front of their guests, and for a beat I felt the old reflex to apologize swelling in my chest like a bruise you press to see if it still hurts, but instead I let the feeling pass and told them that the smallness had been there for years and I had merely opened a window, which means my revenge, if you need the word, was nothing more than fresh air, and yes, it stings the eyes when it first arrives, yet it beats suffocation dressed as tradition. I pushed my chair back an inch, not to leave but to give the truth more room, then said there was one last detail tucked into the final page that might simplify the next conversation, and while Jason stared at the envelope as if it might detonate, I said, in the same measured tone I would use to confirm a dental appointment, that the trust carried a protective clause allowing me to place a temporary restraint on any attempt to encumber the property without my written consent, a clause that would be filed with the county first thing on Monday, which meant that anyone who tried to borrow against the house to feed another round of heroic business decisions would find the door politely but absolutely locked, and even the bank, professional as it is, respects a lock when the key is cut correctly. The room did not erupt so much as sink, the way a field goes quiet before a storm finally breaks, and as I refold the second envelope and set it beside my plate, I told them dessert could wait because we still had a decision to make about what kind of family we were going to be in the light of documents that do not care for bedtime stories. Then I lifted my water, took a slow, deliberate sip, and looked at my brother with a patience I had never afforded him before, telling him there was a way he could still end the night with dignity if he chose it, because I was prepared to trade something that mattered far more to him than money, and when he asked, voice raw, what I could possibly have that he would want, I said his reputation. And I let the word hang there like a final card face down on green felt, the offer unspoken but enormous, the terms mine to name in the next breath that I had not yet taken. Reputation is a currency that spends well in rooms where people trade in perception, and my brother, who has always relied on nods in church pews and backslaps at the hardware store, and the casual deference of neighbors who think success is a matter of volume and square footage, understood almost immediately that I was holding something far more delicate than a deed or a trust instruction. So when I leaned forward and said that I would keep the story short and bloodless if he could, in this very moment, agree to respect boundaries that should never need paperwork, no second mortgage schemes in my name, no midnight calls to my father asking him to co-sign, just until cash flow stabilizes, no subtle smear campaign that paints me as the joyless sister who hates children and tradition. He tried to grin as if we were role-playing a negotiation at a corporate retreat, but his eyes betrayed the calculation of a man measuring the cost of humility against the price of public unraveling. I told him, with the same steady cadence I use when reading terms and conditions line by line because hidden clauses are only hidden if you refuse to see them, that I would not tell the wider family about the delinquent notices and the quiet bank auction, that I would not mention at the neighbor's block party how the second mortgage had been floated to cover a set of marketing campaigns that launched and sank in the same season, that I would not make a scene about the petty lies he had told over the years to garnish himself with sympathy at my expense, small inventions about how I had borrowed a few hundred here or there and forgotten to pay them back when the truth is I have receipts older than his children that would make any accountant blush. Instead, I would offer him an exit wrapped in dignity if he could make, and keep, a single promise that carried real weight. My mother started to protest that reputations are family property and not mine alone to barter, which would have been funny if it were not so grim. And I said gently that I was not bartering the family's good name because that was precisely what had been spent over and over every time they threw my labor on the fire to keep Jason warm, but that I was offering a stay of narrative, a ceasefire of stories, in exchange for something both simple and impossible, which was an apology that acknowledged not the optics of tonight, but the arithmetic of the past, and a written agreement drafted by my attorney that set the boundaries in words the county would recognize if they ever needed to. Jason, who has never apologized without instructing the listener on how to hear it, started to assemble a speech that included the phrase misunderstandings on both sides, at which I lifted my hand and reminded him that apologies are not group projects and that this one had to live in declarative sentences signed with his full government name, dated, witnessed, and followed by the practical act of leaving the table and calling the bank first thing Monday to remove my father as guarantor on his business line, because I was tired of watching the man who taught me to ride a bicycle pay compound interest on the myth of a son who would eventually become careful. My father, perhaps hearing in my voice the same exhausted resolve he once wore when he quit a job that had made him small, said that this seemed fair. And though the words were simple, the look he gave me carried an admission I had wanted since the year I learned to read tax forms, an acknowledgement that I had not been difficult all these years, just awake. And in that moment I felt something uncoil that I had mistaken for anger when in truth it was vigilance, finally allowed to lower its shoulders. Megan, who has never met a silence she could not varnish, asked what would happen if we refused, and I told her with a politeness that came from finally owning my heir that refusal would be their choice and not my burden, and that I would place the facts where they belonged, with the relatives who had spent their lives believing the story my mother preferred, with the board at the church where my grandmother's plaque hangs and where donations in Jason's name had sometimes been more promise than payment, with the polite banker who had already prepared the necessary certified summaries, and perhaps, if I was feeling unusually generous, with a carefully worded letter to the Small Business Association that had twice sponsored his ventures under the belief that he was a steward of other people's money, because sometimes the only way to clean a wound is to let in the air. The room settled around a decision that did not want to be made, and my mother tried one last recourse to the script that has always saved her, claiming that a daughter who humiliates her family has to live with the consequences forever. And I said that forever already lives in my bones and is not scared of her dinner table prophecies. Then I pushed the pen across the table with the document my attorney had drafted on standby, and I watched as Jason, whose pride has always masqueraded as leadership, scanned the lines and saw that each clause was nothing but the shape of boundaries he should have honored without being told, and after a long, careful pause in which the house seemed to hold its breath, he signed with a hand that shook but did not break. I gathered the papers with the precision of a bookkeeper closing a ledger at the end of a year no one will brag about, slipped them into the envelope, and told my mother that dessert could be hers because I had already eaten enough of their expectations to last a lifetime. Then I stood, kissed my father on the crown of his head the way my grandmother used to, and walked to the foyer where the family photos still lined the wall in a chronology that skipped my milestones and enlarged my brother's. Pausing at the frame from the summer when I was 12 and had patched the backyard fence while Jason played hero with a plastic sword, recognizing at last that I had misread the image for years. Because the person holding things together is rarely the one holding the spotlight. At the door I felt them watching, the room heavy with a quiet that could be wisdom or fury or both, and I understood that even perfect paperwork cannot force people to grow. That the apology on the table could wilt or root depending on what they watered it with on Monday morning, that reputations are rescued one day at a time and sometimes only temporarily. And I left without waiting for coffee because I wanted the night to end while my hands still felt steady, stepping into air cold enough to make my breath visible, a small white proof that what is invisible can still be real. And as I walked to my car, I thought about how houses hold histories like jars hold nails and buttons and old keys. And how sometimes the bravest thing you can do with an inheritance is to stop pretending it is a blessing when it has always been a debt. Then I turned the ignition, watched the porch light flicker in the side mirror, and drove away with the understanding that I had not severed the family so much as returned their story to them, untangled from my name, which is not triumph exactly, but it is its own kind of peace, and if there is a reckoning coming it will not need me to narrate it. Thanksgiving was never about gratitude in our house so much as it was about choreography, a precise arrangement of chairs and expectations where my mother presided at the head like a director convinced that good lighting and the right centerpiece could gloss over plot holes large enough to drive a moving van through. And as I carried the last tray of rolls to the table I could feel the script tightening around me, a corset of tradition that made it hard to breathe, but easy to smile in the way everyone preferred, because nothing unsettles a family performance like a woman who refuses to play the role she has been handed since childhood. The turkey was carved into obedient slices, the mashed potatoes held their polite peaks, the cranberry sauce shone like stained glass in a crystal bowl that makes an appearance only once a year. And across from me my brother leaned back with the satisfied sprawl of a man who has been told since birth that gravity itself is on his side, while his wife arranged the children's napkins and gave me a smile so luminous it felt like a warning flare sent up by someone convinced she had already won a battle I did not know I was fighting. My father, who has always been the human dimmer switch that brings the room to a tolerable glow whenever voices rise, cleared his throat and reached for the gravy boat with a carefulness that suggested he could sense weather gathering at the far edge of the tablecloth, though whether it would be a passing squall or a season change neither of us could yet say. It began as it always does, with my mother's version of warmth, a speech disguised as conversation in which compliments are handed out like party favors and expectations like invoices. And it took her less than a minute to turn a remark about how quickly the children were growing into a declaration that families must make decisions with the next generation in mind. That houses are not merely structures, but vessels that carry birthdays and Christmas mornings and scraped knees and prom photos. And that a good sister recognizes when a chapter is closing and another is opening, especially if the new chapter includes a responsible son with a wife and children who deserve stability more than anyone. I watched the words float toward me as if carried on a gentle current, and I could almost admire the engineering involved, the way she managed to lay a moral track and then point to the train already barreling down it, which, if I were a different woman in a different life, might have been enough to make me nod and say of course and pass over a deed as if it were a casserole that needed a new home. What no one at that table understood, or perhaps what they had understood and chosen to ignore because it kept the world tidier, was that I had grown tired of being the silent scaffolding that holds up everyone else's renovations, and that fatigue When it is fed for long enough on double shifts, spreadsheets, and the quiet arithmetic of a woman who learns to turn scarcity into a lever, transforms into a kind of steel that is not loud but is unbreakable. In the spring, when my mother called me to ask, in that casual tone she uses when delivering news that might explode if set down too abruptly, whether I had heard anything from the bank about a document she could not quite place. A document with boxes and dates and words that felt unnecessarily stern. I put on my coat and walked to the branch on Maple where the manager knows me by name, because I once opened an account there with a deposit so small it would have embarrassed anyone who has not been trained by life to take pride in small beginnings, and I asked very simple questions in very calm sentences until the facts lined up like dominoes and whispered a story that was nobody's favorite. A story in which a second mortgage had been taken to rescue a venture that needed truth more than cash and had not received either. The bank, unlike families, does not believe in the power of narrative to redeem poor math, and once I had verified what I already suspected, I began to build my own quiet bridge out of the swamp, plank by careful plank. Starting with a meeting about arrears and grace periods and the unromantic beauty of certified funds, then continuing with phone calls that required the polite persistence my mother mislabels stubbornness, and finally arriving at a purchase agreement that moved through the system with the efficiency of a river following gravity, though I cannot pretend it flowed on its own, because the current is always strongest when you have spent years training your muscles to paddle against everything that tells you to float. I did not tell anyone because I had learned the cost of sharing plans with people who mistake your caution for permission to sabotage, and besides, it felt righteous to let the work speak in its native language, which is paperwork stamped, filed, and indexed, where searches can find it long after holiday speeches fade. So when my mother set down her glass and, with that small smirk she confuses with authority, announced that my brother deserved the family home because he had mouths to feed and a legacy to uphold, when she turned toward me as if awarding a medal for good sportsmanship in a game I had not agreed to play, I placed my fork on the edge of my plate in a gesture so quiet it sounded like a bell only to me. And I said that if we were discussing the house it would help to consult the person who owns it, which drew a soft laugh from my brother and a brighter one from his wife and a blank look from my father, and then I added that it was a good thing I had already bought it out from under them, which is not a phrase you utter lightly at a table set with china and heirlooms. Yet, sometimes the only way to stop a story from swallowing you whole is to throw it a bone it cannot digest. The silence that followed did not simply fall, it unfolded like a tent being raised in a storm, and under that shelter of sudden quiet I saw every face I have ever loved arranged in disbelief, offense, and something else that looked very much like recognition, and I understood that we had reached a junction that would either become a reckoning or a repair. I did not reach for the envelope in my bag because surprises are not my preferred weapon and because victory is rarely secured by gloating, but I did let the moment breathe, and as it did I wondered whether any of them would ask how I had done it. Whether anyone at this table, where I have passed dishes and swallowed slights for more years than I care to count, would see the difference between theft and rescue, between an ambush and a boundary, between a daughter who has learned to be practical, and a woman who has chosen to be free.